Observation 1 is the framework. The first argument is the resolution. The United States federal government should provide significant air support to aid in the stabilization of South Sudan. The second argument is that the United States federal government's power dynamics is predicated on oppression of native bodies. It has continually expanded its territory over First Nations, enhanced its sovereignty by oppressing First Persons, and has acclimated authority over whitewashing other countries' indigenous populations. The third argument is that questions of methodology come first. This is because they inform the method or reasoning behind our actions. Furthermore, bad methodology breeds bad policymaking. Iraq is the empiric in which the flawed methodology of trying to root out non-existent weapons of mass destruction allowed for massive amounts of civilian casualties. The fourth argument is that the United States federal government uses laws, regulations, and the courts to deceive natives. Rules and standards are thus the internal link to oppression, because natives are always subjugated to these policies, deceived by treaties to be tricked off their land, and never given any kind of access towards interps that are always drafted in favor of their oppressor. The fifth argument is that the resolution requires us to defend the United States federal government, empowering the United States federal government, and causing docile bodies within this debate space. The sixth argument is that we must not remain silent in the face of ongoing colonization. We all live on stolen land, and we are all personally responsible for ongoing colonization because we exclude discussions of first persons, needs, and concerns. Thus, the government's silence on these issues is equivalent to ongoing colonization. The seventh argument is that the resolution must be rejected. This is because it exercises power that we have no inherent right to bear. The continuation of this practice is equivalent, thus, to ongoing colonization and systemic violence against first persons' concerns. The eighth argument is that debate is the key space towards interrogating oppression. The eighth argument is an academic co-curricular activity absent the state of its lenses, which allows for ourselves to criticize and critique the United States federal government without being co-opted or squelched. The B argument is home to future policymakers and human rights activists, which indicates that the methodologies that we endorse here in debate actually do matter and carry spill over into the actual world. The C arguments that allows for ourselves to interrogate our relationships with topics that we formerly would not have interrogated, and the D arguments that forces us into being educated on topics that are outside our academic fields of study.
Question?
The question.
Given that South Sudan was formed in 2011, what is their relationship to indigenous peoples that existed on this continent?
This is a great point you bring up, because that's my exact next observation, which is observation 2, the links. The first argument is that the resolution requires us to aid the presidency of President Kiir, which replicates colonization on the indigenous Nuer tribe. Since the state inception, Kiir has pushed the Nuer tribe to the periphery. The resolution thus increases the state power so that they can better co-opt and dominate the Nuer tribe. Literally, they instigate policies which allow for themselves to identify households that have indigenous Nuer tribesmen within them, so that they can better isolate and eradicate or disproportionately move them in their status quo. The second argument is that South Sudan is equivalent to a 21st century example of colonization. This is because Matt Rosenberg, a South African geographer, indicated that over 80% of South Sudan was formerly controlled by indigenous power structures. However, the United States imposed a governmental structure along with the international community so that we could garner better access towards their oil resources. The third argument is that President Obama uses acts like the resolution to spread colonization. Al Jazeera reported on December 22nd that the Obama administration announced its full support of the genocidal President Kiir, despite the fact that they continue to have massive amounts of human rights violations, and calls to have international investigations for human rights violations at support and at the hands of the Kiir presidency. The fourth argument is that our support of the Kiir presidency assures the usage of child soldiers. The Valley Forge and Cayman Diversity of Evolutionary Soldiers Project reports that George Washington received authorization from the Continental Congress to use child soldiers to first squelch native populations. Similarly, Obama waived the U.S. Child Soldiers Protection Act of 2008 for Yemen, Chad, and South Sudan so that they could receive United States military aid, assuring that we replicate structures of colonial violence over indigenous populations on to these nations. The fifth argument is that the resolution empowers the United States federal government, which has too readily used military technology such as air support and massive amounts of technological superiority to be able to squelch indigenous populations' concerns, which assures that we continue to rely on excluding populations in discussions as to how the U.S. military has harmed indigenous populations to promote hegemony. Thus, observation 3 is the alternative mode of thinking. Evan Johnson and I demand the United States federal government off this land. Evan Johnson and I demand the United States federal government off this land.
What is this land?
The land that the USFG assumes is its.
So just at U.S. in all territories?
Whatever territory that the colonial actors determines is, it has privilege.
Our solvency is that thinking this way is able to empower Native Americans. This is because non-natives have everything to gain and nothing to lose from thinking this way. The second argument is that liberation of the land must be our first priority. This is because it's critical to radical social change, in which we interrogate the privileges that we have experienced from the colonial actor on this land and how we relate to those privileges. The third act is the affirmative, is an act of impossible realism. The EA argument is the question arises if giving back the land is feasible. However, no form of decolonization has ever been viewed as feasible within the construct of a colonial paradigm. The B argument is that in order to begin resistance, anti-colonial actors must abandon orthodox realism in favor of what they know is right. Thus, redefinition of reality in terms deemed impossible by their oppressors key towards radical social change. The C argument is that Native Americans have no alternative now but to carry on. Only redefinition solves because it breaks the system of oppression. The North Vietnam are the ultimate example of how impossible realism is able to solve their opposition to United States occupation occupation in Vietnam was literally deemed as impossible by the international community. However, their continued deterrence and opposition to the United States occupation allowed for them to survive carpet bombings, their forests being burned by Agent Orange communities, and villages being destroyed, and massive amounts of U.S. military and technological superiority and equipment being used against their population so that they were able to ride through their opposition and expel the United States influence. Similarly, we indicate that anti-colonial actors must begin thinking in terms deemed impossible by their oppressor if we are going to begin true revolutionary action so that we can prevent the inception of colonialism in our everyday lives. Observation 4 is the impacts of our continued mode of thought. The first argument is that colonialism makes violence inevitable. This is because denial of its atrocities allows for the United States federal government to replicate its violence. Denial of the atrocities that occurred in Sand Creek allowed for the United States federal government to replicate that violence at Tschida, which denial of the massacre of Tschida led to the savagery in Japan, which we denied and allowed for the savagery in the Philippines, Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Thus, denial of colonialism and colonialism leads to reciprocal violence, which is never questioned, and the United States federal government continues to instigate this violence on indigenous populations. The second argument is that colonialism ensures environmental destruction. This is because it justifies literally moving mountains so that we can continue to garner access to its resources to promote the U.S. hegemonic regime so that we can continue to maintain access towards a very powerful military as well as a very powerful colonial structure. This assures that at the point that we continue to replicate our ideology onto the third world to deplete them of resources that we never allow for other nations or populations to speak out against the United States federal government, which assures that environmental destruction becomes inevitable. The third argument is that colonialism destroys autonomy because it literally creates policies that deceive and prevent affiliation with First Persons and First Nations. Blood quantum laws from the Department of Interior literally state that you cannot affiliate with a First Nation unless you're a 1/16th or 1/8 Native American, which assures that we whitewash their culture until we have colonial power structures as the main power. Thus, this indicates that their violence and suffering becomes invisible and pushed to the periphery, which allows for ourselves to replicate that violence in other populations. At the end of the day, you have the ability to think differently, to interrogate the privilege that you have experienced from ongoing colonization, and to deny inception of colonization in your everyday lives.
Is the cat a hidden advantage?
Oh, sorry, I just used a piece of paper and it had a cat on it already drawn.
Did Melissa draw that cat? Melissa drew the cat. There is a hidden advantage in the room, if you can find that. Maybe you got us. Alright, so what's the order?
2 off.
2 off.
Is one from the cake?
No.
Thank you.
Then the solvency debate. And then the
Solvency debate is in the
observation 3.
Okay. Yeah, alternative.
Yeah, kind of do like framework.
Yeah, cool. No, I got you. We just make sure we're on the same page.
Gotcha. Then their framework debate, the impacts debate, and the solvency debate. Yeah. 2 off. Solvency debate, framework debate, impact debate, and if you put it, have to put it all on one sheet or be time. First off, framework debate points the interpretation the affirmative must present a topical plan and justify the plan by its implementation of the United States federal government. Again, the affirmative must present a topical plan and justify the plan by its implementation of the United States federal government. The beast points that are definitional for the first argument, the United States federal government is the federal government located in Washington, D.C. The second argument that should indicate an expectation to action or a moral call to action. The C points the violation argument that the affirmative does not defend the topical justification of their plan, but rather their independent demands of the United States federal government to take action in that instance in case that they are not that actor within that context. These point the standard's first argument is that this actually topical arguments that provides for them ground outside of the resolution based upon their independent actions arguments that would be an independent voting issue, or issue of ground also indicates that decreasing the educational round because we've not talked that ultimately proves the resolution insufficient, which the second argument's ground arguments that decreases the amount of grounds or the links that we can generate to disact based upon their action as well as our counterplane competition. The third argument's topical education is absolutely essential arguments the discussion of the topic in a way that it is actually is essential to understand the repercussions that occur as a result of the implementation of that policy. The fourth argument is arguing that the interpretation that limits most limits best argues that a world in which you allow for actions outside the United States government, then there are literally an infinite number of solvency mechanisms that they could resolve. But the fifth argument is that there's a topical version of your affirmative. You could discuss a negativist reading of the topic specifically and indicate that why that implementation be essential to the point that this is a voting issue for fairness and education. The next off of the net benefits of the framework. The first argument is ethical scapegoating arguments that blaming the negative for the topic means that there's ultimately going to be the destruction of the debate. Arguments that the idea that we can never be understanding of their affirmative or never agree within this context indicates that there's an ethical scapegoating. The second argument that their framework sees the political to right-wing violence arguments, the refusal to engage in the policy process indicates that the right-wing control is inevitably the ones that make the policy within that context, empirically demonstrated in 2001, where the United States refused to engage in the political process, and a large amount of academic opposition to Afghanistan occurred within the academy, indicate that that is what allowed for that violence to occur in the first place. The fourth argument is the process to speech arguments that just as the process of politics of land distribution ultimately decreases democracy, ensures that those individuals who are deterred from that are ultimately deterred from that process in the status quo are excluded. But the fifth argument is participatory decision-making arguments that is essential to solve for civil society, which solves for their inclusion concerns. But the sixth argument is pragmatism, or argument that viewing the state as a permanently evil actor destroys micro-political revolution to increase individuals' quality of life. In this context, in a case that is the only way to be able to resolve for that violence. But the seventh argument is ethnocentrism, arguing for the discussion of the topic without actually engaging within the feed-on implementation of that policy, indicates that allows for the violence to continue to occur towards the Jalin, the Tschida, the Shirgai, and the Shukira, who are the four tribes in Sudan. You can go to the case debate now. The first argument is that their thought experiment is ultimately justifies horrible things. The eighth point is that allows for the solution disposition is not more disposition, but ultimately that leads to violence. Argument the idea that we can ultimately remove harm to our problems, or ultimately remove ownership, indicates that we do not see the historical lineage in which we have allowed for that violence to occur. But the beast point is the notion of land justice is what allows for geopolitical conflict. This is what allows for the conflict to occur within India and Pakistan, because each individual or each side ultimately says that they own claim to that land. But the cease point is that the borderlands, this that argument that culture is not static, and there's no land-based politics destroy identities of culture that ultimately exist outside the borderlands. Arguments that they tie the native identity specific to the land indicate that that is absolutely essential. That is comparative to the romanticization that occurred within the 1800s that allowed for the United States to rape, pillage, and steal, and specifically steal land, because we saw that it was absolutely essential. But the fifth argument, the point is the hybridity dissent argument that all of us are entangled in one another. This justifies artificial divisions to lead to violence against hybrid identities, specifically those who might not be seen as native, but still might not be read as native, which allows for them to sort of continue those blood problems within the future. But these points of distance, the stat argument for the discourse of native specifically allows for the incarceration of us to separate from our incarceration of the other, as we separate from ourselves. Arguing the idea that we are ultimately opposite within this context indicates that we are ultimately those who are forms those who commit to that form of violence within the future. Arguing that sort of distance is what allows for violence to occur within the future, because we do not see ourselves within the native identity. But the second argument is impossible realism fails. The eighth point is that imagining decolonialism inevitably fails. Arguing that post-independent state politics proves specifically within Western Bengal from the United Kingdom. Arguing that their policy was specifically to engage in the political process, to be able to resolve for those sort of forms of decolonization, not necessarily to imagine. But the speech of point is that this the plan ultimately leads to a decrease in healing and is ultimately reductive. Is arguing that the affirmative is not necessarily focused on the affirmative is focused on compensation, ultimately precludes focus upon healings and way in which we can resolve for that sort of interpersonal acts of violence. But the cease point is that it centralizes the native body as specifically outside of politics, indicates that the native bodies are impossible of engaging in the political process in the status quo. That centralization is what forecloses upon the ability to have that sort of reform in the future. But these points that reparation talks mean that the reparation talks have empirically been passed watered down, which indicates that even if you allow for a change in ideology, that's just been empirically disproven, because the United States has talked about reparations. The NDT is sure talked about reparations for having a topic, but that has never occurred. But the these points that this ultimately causes numbing and nihilism, the idea that imagining the United States government office label inevitably fails. The thought experiment leads to numbing and nihilism, indicates that we will never be able to take action to actually resolve for the issues that we see. But the absolute point is that thinking reform is impossible is what turns people's conservatism indicates, that they do not think that radical change is ultimately possible, which indicates that individuals are complacent within larger acts of violence, and specifically the Jesus points that the rights of land ultimately miscalculated, ultimately masculinizes reparative justice, arguing that this submits private property as a concept and specifically a Western ideology. But the ancient points that PMC homogenized political existence in the United States, arguing that one-size-fits-all approach fails because some communities might want different things. Yeah.
Are we as individuals not complacent or doing any acts in the debate community to eliminate this violence or this ongoing
arguing that each individual might have their own sort of political process, arguing that just simply engaging in politics.
This is a yes or no question, though. That's not an answer to my question.
Demands are counterproductive and ultimately turn the affirmative. The ace points that demands inflate the antagonist, arguing that creates an impetus whereby the antagonist is more likely to pursue aggressive policies in the future. But the beast point is that it leads to counter demands, arguing that in a world in which the United are we ultimately increase demands upon other individuals. Other individuals are likely to demand counter demands in order to ensure that they get something out of it as a quid pro quo. quote, but the cease and points and demands cause scapegoating, and restoring to the United States federal government, specifically Obama, might not say that the Trail of Tears were her, or was his fault if he was ultimately pressured, in case that he would just push that onto Andrew Jackson, as opposed to understanding the forms of colonization that he's perpetuating. Status quo. The visa point is that ultimately threatening nature of demands ultimately leads to hostility, argues that the idea that we have to demand something as opposed to request something is what allows for a hostile environment whereby there's impossible to have any sort of cohesive social movement going forward. But the east points that demands leads to credibility, or leads credibility to the harm. The example here is that if you were to demand something out of their parking spot, then somebody would begin justifying why they have to have that parking spot within the first place. Arguing that is the similar example. The fourth argument that demands don't work. The eighth point is they ultimately perceive a deception, arguing that having an ulterior, they're seen as having an ulterior motive. But the beast points that demands decrease the ability for feedback because the immediate nature of them will prevent an effective starting point for communication. But you can ultimately go to their framework debate now.
Question?
Nope. First argument, pragmatism results with these arguments. You must evaluate consequences. You can evaluate, you can cross-apply that from the framework debate. You can still include their discussions within that calculus. The second argument is that your UCPL would ultimately not empower the state. It would just be an example of why you are criticizing state policy and status quo impact debate now. The United States, in pursuance of hegemony and violence, is inevitable. The eighth security politics. The United States will never pursue a ruleless lens. But the beast points, McKendry and T is still reading the project. Means that there's probably going to be some sort of templates of trying to pursue shooting the cease points that desires absolute essential in case that the United States will never value power. But the second argument that value life exists regardless of government policy framework or late debate now. Arguments that you can ultimately group this debate here is ultimately an elected democratic official. Arguments that their criticism of him is a calling of the South Sudanese as incapable of focusing upon democracy within the status quo, which turns individuals against democracy.
What are we calling this second page?
It's net benefits.
Net benefits of the framework. All right, it's going to be the framework page, the net benefits to the framework page, and then case in the order in which they exist. Actually, let's put a.
No.
You want to do it in that order? I was going to put case on top. It's not going to take me very long to get through it all.
No.
My page just got shuffled. Tell me what my order was again.
Yes.
It was solvency framework links, or no, solvency framework impacts.
Okay, that's what I was going to do.
Everyone locked, loaded, and ready and bloated? Sounds good. One is going to be on there in term one. Genocide is not a top-down administered but atrocity, but instead is culturally cultivated through grassroots movements and representations of individual complacency with genocidal movements that are key to their success. Number two is your interpretation creates a system of exclusion in which certain discussions become to absolute truth for closing all else. This is the reason why we don't have native communities. They have to create their own school systems because their type of education and value systems were not valued within the Western notions of what was and what wasn't. Curated capital T truth that ultimately ignored them. Number three is their interrupt forces Dan, who identifies as Native American to represent his oppressors, which is ultimately race. They cannot confine his identity to one that conforms to the U.S. federal government. This is going to be a reason why they will lose the end of the debate. One leads to counter interpretation is that we don't have to defend the U.S. federal government. This is key to challenging this. This creates a challenging incentive for interpretation. Means a rearrangement of our perception of the meta perception of the world. This involves a re-examination of the body of the human knowledge and how a structural reconstruction into a new format that ultimately leads to a more productive system of knowledge. Also, it suggests that people can be made to change their oppressive activity by intellectual reorientation alone. Like every time we win this argument, it changes the quality of the discussion of Give Back the Land and the type of jokes that are made throughout the hallway. As I walk down the hallway when I read these arguments, people think it's funny in the debate space now. They think it's funny that Washburn JL reads this argument all the time. I don't think it's funny. See, this is an examination of the point is key starting point to change the conversations within the debate community that allow for people not to read arguments like this, that you don't get to talk about this oppression because it's not the topic and we should only talk about the USFD. This is a terrible interpretation because it only excludes bodies like Dan who cannot represent those interpretations. This, at least in standards debate one, is One is going to be better for limits. They're focused on limits and genders. The final practice is by stopping productive discussions. We must incorporate alternative perspectives in order to stop violence. You would just limit off the native body that release itself from its oppressive state. Limits exclude. You are focused on over-limiting and exclude, and are inherently subjective process objectifying rules of obliterates agency by forcing the perspective of others to ensure your oppression continues specifically in the debate space. So your also dialogue is limitless. There allows new possibilities for that. This means the limits are infinite. This means the limits because language cannot be confined, which means there's only ways there are limits can regenerate a method in which to solve all your offense, which I'll explain also. They say they group all their policy arguments in one. It's concept that policy making is ultimately bad. They do not solve our Aff because they don't have a topical version of the Aff conception of politics falls to a form of absolute control that overlimits the realm of political making, political sphere making true representations of the self are possible. Like Dan, being able to identify as a native body, the K precludes the politics is allows for understanding of it that it solves problems more effectively because it breeds colonial policy, which ultimately dooms their policies to failure. This is better for the ground because it's bad for their permanent stable foundations of ground because human agency is always challenging, changing the gray area between objectivism and relativism is ignored. This leads us because this allows for better forms of education in the sense where its knowledge is knowledge of subjective is based on the violent subjectivity. Your knowledge of production is only silences other experience that exists outside your Western construct of what good valued education is. You learned about the topic already, which means shifting topics. No, I'm going to stick them to this framework argument. You are going to lose because you read this argument. Stable. Also, the state's centricity makes critical understandings of the world impossible. The alternative provides a crucial link between knowledge and action reorientation of political discourse toward the epistemological concern. This brings up one there. Also, they say the expectation of action still. We create a stasis point of the resolution. All our link arguments, which solves all their educational claims, which means there's only risk they recreate state centricity, this violence. In the status quo, you will literally be voting for Washburn jail because we have a stasis point for the topic, which solves all their educational topics. Our interpretation just says we don't have to defend the U.S. federal government, which means that we have a clear disadvantage to their interpretation. Our entire affirmative is an impact turn to this, which means they will lose. Also, under the net benefits, one, they say the right-wing colonial space. We were talking about the debate space, not this. Also, they say political politics is key to things like democracy. Democracy is what removed and colonialized genocide in the first place. They say civil society, that is racist, civilized. The idea of society is ultimately what colonialized a structure like the debate space that push out the debate, to push out the native out of the conversation. Also, they say yet implementation is key to this. There is already violence in the space, which means the alternative is ultimately key to solving this, which means you will not be able to resolve. Yeah, let's...
There's no micro-political discussions.
Yeah, there's no micro-political discussions now. Also, wherever you have the Bengal politics process, what does that do in the debate space? So the political process still assuming that fiat happens. We were talking about in the debate realm. They essentialize it. They say essentialize the native body, but this creates menonomic freeze. We need to address the actual racist confrontations that we have about Native Americans in the status quo. Without it, we only recreate those racist ideologies. They say change ideology. Nihilism will ultimately be the result of nihilism. Now it's the jokes that are happening in the hall. There's only we make natives first priority, which means we change the conversation. They say that we become complacent in larger acts of violence. No, because of homogenization, all individuals create their own relationship to the alternative. That is the imagination process. Let's go to case now. One is going to be on observation. One, they say demands counterproductive. What demands on the state or not. People ultimately they will not be able to resolve this. This means they say also demands on the state, not the individuals. The individuals create their own relationship and allow themselves to inherit their own privilege and relationship to the topic. Because everyone has their own social location with their own social relationships that allow for them to have disadvantages and privileges over native bodies. This interrogation creates a personal relationship. Probably internally turns most of their offense on the page. Also, they say scope noting, but personal relationship probably solves that because we're not talking about the state. We're focusing on individual complacency in the space that allows for the conversation to make fun of the native struggle. Also, they say demand justifies why they are colonial in the first place. But also, we don't give power. This demand is key to denying power to the state because we do not give them any credence. We demand that this happens in this space because otherwise people will not listen to us. They are not now, which means we have to do the affirmative. No one ever asks how the topics affect the native body. There's no topic that says the Cherokee Nation should. Why? Because no one makes these demands on the debate community. We are doing that now, and we change the conversation. This leads us. Let's go to the impact page. Sorry, I'm rearranging. One is they say violence inevitable because of things like McKinstry and T. I think that we are the solvency for these types of arguments. They make a mockery of the violence that happens in the status quo. They make a joke of what is happening now in the debate space. This joke ultimately makes me feel uncomfortable and makes me feel excluded in the space because it makes fun of something I care about. I've been reading this argument for years and I'm still dealing with the dismissive conversations that are happening in the space. We are the only way to resolve the colonialist tactics that exclude us from the space. Yeah, question.
What joke did we ever make in our LOC?
You continue to say that this colonialism is inevitable, which it's not. We're the ones that make colonialism inevitable. It's you saying that's inevitable that makes it inevitable.
How is that a joke?
Okay, let's go to links. One is they say democratic elected officials, so we are only racist continuation of colonization. You are conceding that we created democracy that ultimately pushed out the native body in the first place, which is inherently bad. We need to be able to challenge this because it allows for things like child soldiers to be developed, colonialization, which only contributes to the militaristic tendencies of the colonial structure, which ultimately makes all of our impacts inevitable. They will not be able to resolve this on the alternative page.
Lose them. Lose them.
Cool, thank you. When you want to group all of these arguments, they do not link. We create our own interpersonal relationship with the topic. They are misconceptualize this. We have no, we do not claim possession over the land, but rather we look to the alternative. It doesn't say we give back the land, but rather that we demand the USFG off the land. There is no land rights. We are removing the people who have demanded that they have possession on the land now. This is the link turn argument they will not have a response to, which means all this goes away. And our personal interrogation relationship to all of the topic means that we do not create a center point around natives, but rather the person who is hearing the rhetoric in this space, which means they do not have a link to any of their offense on this page. Their discourse arguments are not intrinsic to the affirmative, but rather the status quo, which means we resolve all of this. You can literally group all of it. It doesn't matter. We don't recreate any of the impacts because, and the mnemonic freeze solves the result of this offense. Go back to framework.
What's mnemonic freeze?
Hold them accountable. Natives are always held accountable. Colonizers always get to push natives from this fucking space, and we never get to solve anything. I'm tired of losing because people think I don't get to talk about the violence that happens in this space and how people make Dan and I feel for reading this argument.
Remember?
I will take a moment to deal with the last 5 seconds that happened after the timer. Don't quite like being yelled at.
I don't like being told stop and say it's racist.
So the order is framework.
Your framework?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. And then I want you to go to their framework. I know the case debate gets a little messy, but I'm going to start off in the LSE order. The first argument, stare with the thought experiment, that stuff, that's where I want you to start to.
Is your net benefit of framework arguments also in framework or?
My bad, yeah, it's framework and that benefit. Their framework page. Then solvency of the affirmative. The links to the app. And the impact of the app. At the end of the debate, you will not look me in the eye and say that this is the only way to talk about native politics. That's rather homogenizing. And they've conceded a couple arguments about why the policy of land right redistribution is actually very traumatic for those who have to deal with the geopolitical politics of those constantly fighting over this notion of land. It's bad politics, y'all. We will win the framework debate because we'll defend it, but we'll give reasons why there's an alternative to your method. Extend across the interpretation, the affirmative has to defend a topical version of the plan to defend the implementation of the Beast Boys that we had definitional support that's conceded. The one is that the United States federal government is located in Washington, D.C. The second is that should indicate you must do an action, but the second is a violation. You are not a topical nor instrumental affirmation of the topic. Go to the genocide debate. The East Boys counter-interpretation solved this argument. The one is that Ben gave you an example. You were able to talk about the South Sudanese natives, in which the African debate for the United States government to support those native bodies and talk about ways in which you can flip colonialism by line for post-colonial literature to be talked about, and the status quo. The second is that this means you ignore the entirety of the literature based about the way in which international relations have actually been taken by people of color, because instead of denying the United States federal government, there's an action about the ways in which she can use it against itself. The second argument is that you are dogmatic. The East Boys that ground turns your argument absent the belief for the negative to engage in the topic. You exclude us and structurally create a play in space where we have to say that we be claiming natives is bad. Ben and I can never make an argument as to why the United States federal government was not colonialist, which indicates that that would put us in a position of complete interpersonal violence, which means that we will be forced into having to say the worst forms of things. The second is that this means you will
only create more Dick Cheneys because you force the negatives to thinking of a process of thinking that's inherently violent because we have to think against your own personal experience. Think about every no link on the case debate. It's all because Evan and Dan say no link. We're only talking about to you people. This means that you make the next structurally have to argue against everyone in this room and also structurally argue against the life experience of these two wonderful individuals who we would never want to argue against. But the next argument here is you say the United States federal government is racist. That is a marginalization. You've conceded that there are Native American senators and people in the House of Representatives in the status quo, which means you would functionally kick them out of the United States federal government as well. The next argument here is counter-interpretation. These ways that this links to all our offense. It doesn't resolve the argument about negative flexibility nor any negative research. The impact of this is limits. You've conceded that the topic which limits mass is critical to one is that it endows us with a better form of knowledge. Having a limit means that we're able to engage in a stasis point of debate. If your interpretation is that you don't have to defend the United States federal government, that can literally be anything because you could have chose every single country that exists on this world and did a plan which defended a policy from them. Now the limits debate, you said limits is violence, these ways non-unique. There must be some form of limits to our speech times. There inevitably on time you have to wake up in the morning to come here to question about whether or not we make those limits productive. We have two dissents as to why you don't make limits productive. The one is the ground. You've conceded that there is no links to the affirmative, which indicates that the negative is forced into making framework. You're arguing about how it's morally bad to make framework actually links to you because you forced us to have to breathe that out of our mouths in the first place. But the second argument is topical education solves. We gave you a counter-interpretation which indicates the words of topical version of your average solves this office. Now the dialogue matters to me. Ace points that dialogue is not limitless. Debate is a limited dialogue in which we must contest over certain political spaces. One is that's critical agency. You've conceded that in fact because if we're not able to know about the political process of policy making, we can never fight against those policies. Now you say policy is bad because of the topic. These ways this links to our scapegoating argument, blaming the negative for a topic that they did not create, creates hostility in the debate sphere because we feel like we are somehow responsible for a process that was actually given down to us and blames us instead of the wider structural problem. But the debate that causes the individuals to feel bad. It makes me make arguments against Dan and Evan, which is impossible because I would never want to bring that kind of shaming into the debate space because that causes people to have to leave. For the cease points that causes the humanization. It ignores the beliefs of micro-revolutionary. You wouldn't tell black people that they should not have advocated for civil rights, much as you wouldn't tell Puerto Ricans that they could not make the world of Puerto Rico better. There are arguments that there is a space for that to happen. I'll get you at the bottom now. You say knowledge production is bad. These ways that means you don't trust us. We can run counter-hegemonic knowledge, but you can still have a topical stasis point for your affirmative, which means we resolve those arguments with the beast points. You can see the participatory democracy argument, which indicates that your form of demand actually decreases democracy because we do not get a say in the motive of you. You can never contest your space against us. You say that knowledge is action. These ways, the topical version of you have solves, but these ways your knowledge is a form of exclusion. You destroyed 3 weeks of my life in which I researched the topic to be able to expect to talk about it. Then you threw it all away and said that my research was not relevant. You say that we have a stasis point. These ways that no, you're not. Your stasis point is impossible. It merely is anything that's outside the United States government, which is limitless. I will prove this on the case to be not in the benefit.
Question? I'll get you later.
They say you can group all the arguments about the debate space. They have conceded ethical scapegoating. This turns all your arguments. You blame the negative for a topic. There's has a couple impacts. So one is it means that there's more violence in the interim. It means that you created a debate space that's completely more hostile. Your only argument against this is not unique. However, our argument indicates that we have a way to solve this because we allow for ourselves to engage in political. The second is you also conceded the process is that justice needs to be participation demanding upon it destroys the belief for there to be democracy. Now you say democracy in civil society is bad. They explain that this is a Western form of viewing, and democracy in Africa is not democracy in America. You would not conflate those two because that is a racist determination about how people do their own politics. Democracy started in Africa, y'all. It started in Egypt. It started from the Pan-African movement, and white people stole it via Aristotle and Plato. They read the book called Black Socrates. The next argument here is you say micropolitics wouldn't be able to solve. You've conceded that topic version of your AF will be able to do that. You've also conceded the ethnocentric dissent. This is devastating. Counter-interpretation of your AF avoids the ethnocentric dissent. The eighth point is magnitude. You've conceded that the focus on native tribes destroys the possibility for there to be a discussion of tribes in South Sudan, causes there to be infinite deferral in which we always talk about the land that's only relevant to us. The second dissent this links to is the distance dissent, which indicates that talking about natives creates this artificial distance in which we never are able to engage with the geographical proximity of other people's suffering. Now, the framework debate of the affirmative. They have conceded the topical version of your AF and pragmatism solves. Draw a circle around these lines. If a T version of your AF solves your framework and you did not answer that argument, then all our offense about why USFG not being that is a bad interpretation that resolves that. Your question? Yeah, a lot of your offense comes from saying you wouldn't say how to advocate for rights, but your argument is confining us to how we should advocate for native rights in the debate space.
It's not confining you. It's saying that there's a methodology that is more comfortable for us debating in this space. Solvency. They have conceded that engaging in the thought experiment and giving back the land is bad. This is devastating, y'all, and you know this. Evan goes to a couple places on case, but does not get to the top of it. The one is the politics of disposition is means like firing fire, which fire, this constant violence of constant resentment in which we try to kill people because they killed us. Is the same kind of essentialism that destroys the ability for there to be more peaceful modes of resolution. The second is you conceded that land justice leads to conflict. He says this is essentialism. It's not essentialism, but rather is historical, which we would solve that back. Goes to our framework. Since you say nihilism now, however, that is not an excuse for our dissent. You've conceded the borderlands dissent, which indicates that this kind of nihilism romanticizes and staticizes those people who actually live on the borders and do not live in the United States federal government. There are tribes that are designated under the Mexican border who would very much be excluded from your discussion. Now, he says individuals, however, this is where we can abuse our framework. You say that we don't link to any of these dissents because you're only talking about people in the room. I can't get a damn dissent to say giving back the land is bad because you say no link, we're talking to the judges. What does the Neg do then? The negative ground is then saying that them having a discussion with Tschida and the rest of the judges here is bad. There's not a dissent to that. That is the abuse story. That was the no-link debate. Moreover, even if you give them that, you say the internet, that we are an interpersonal topic, however, framework. I'll waste that argument. The increased ability for us to engage. You say alternative demand. It means how that is the abuse. You say only people here, however, you've conceded that destroys the ability for there to be healing because it's reductive. People do not want to get off the land, but rather want to cope and live with each other. You've also conceded that the hybridity to that. We are all part of each other. We are all by blood complicit with colonialism. However, the question that you must beg yourself is then how do we deal with ourselves? Why we are here. You've also conceded demands are bad. They cause further to be ulterior motives to constantly question you and cause counter-demands. The impacts of counter-demands to state violence. The link debate. Your answer to the link debate is racist. Our arguments that we could create a conflation between African democracy and American democracy. Your child soldiers' arguments actually the opposite. That is the opposition. Kerr was democratically elected, not trusting South Sudan allows for that paternal gaze, which forces the United States to have to dominate because we never trust others. Now the impacts. This was not a joke. You can see the desire is inevitable and the value of life exists. To question about how we can reform security. If U.S. hegemony materially exists, how do you deal with it afterwards?
So the order will be our framework position with the framework net benefits on top. Then their framework. Then I'm actually going to go the impact page of the affirmative, the link page of the affirmative, and then our case arguments. Good with that.
This is an easy decision for SIU for two reasons. The first of which is that they have conceded reasons why there is a topical version of their affirmative that would resolve for all their discussion arguments and not force Dan into a way in which he increased the United States government power, would actually criticize it by criticizing the United States power within the status quo and criticizing current United States policy. The second of which is that they have also conceded multiple reasons as to why their specific form of method, which is what this debate is apparently about, is problematic because it forces scapegoating and forces us to debate why individuals we like very much is bad, or are bad. You can go to the framework debate now. They will have to go for the argument why our interpretation forces Dan to define as the United States government and forces him to play as his colonizer. Three arguments. The first of which that the alternative to that is scapegoating, which indicates that there would be the inevitable collapse of debate. They have conceded that argument. A world in which we constantly have to debate against other individuals and debate why those individuals is bad is a horrible model for debate, and I think the last 3 rounds of the NPTE has demonstrated that. We all know what has occurred. We all know that the problems that occur as a result of that. It turns people away from the activity. That is something that you should consider. But the second of which is that we cannot win an argument against a debater. It is impossible to prove why that individual is bad because those issues are non-falsifiable. But the third of which is that if we win the reasons why there's a topical version of their affirmative and why advocating for that would actually allow for the criticism of current United States policy, then that would be a reason why we'd be able to resolve for that. Think of the critical affirmative. The critical affirmative is not endorsing the United States federal government. The critical affirmative is criticizing what the United States federal government is currently doing. I.e. the fact that you can engage a policy that decreases the current level of colonization and criticize that praxis. In addition, you can drop on down. They say the limits debate is what allows for genocide to occur. Our counterinterpretation would be able to resolve for these issues. The first of which is that they have conceded a reason why there's a topical version of the affirmative, that they can engage in that discussion in a meaningful way. That solves for all of our limits arguments. Those limits debates ultimately outweigh any of those other concerns for two reasons. The eighth point is an a priori access question. If we are unable to access the debate meaningfully in the LOC, then it means that we have to make new arguments in the EMO that are straight turned in the PMR, making it impossible for us to compete. But the B point is that they have conceded multiple reasons as to why that impacts multiple other levels of the debate. That's a probability scenario about why our standards ultimately would outweigh theirs. You can go on to the framework net benefit. I want two arguments. The first, which is that the ethical scapegoating argument that is largely conceded, they do not have a response about why their specific method of debate, saying that it is about our individual relationships with the judges or our individual relationships with natives. That is problematic because we will never be able to understand those relationships. We will never be able to engage in those because we have to criticize the individual. The second, which is that they have also conceded the process is set. Education and democracy is ultimately created within Africa, which indicates that we can engage this process in a largely educational way by talking with Africa. Do you have anything, Josh?
A good example is that they blame us for there not being a topic about Cherokees.
The good example is, if you think about why they blamed us for not having a topic on Cherokees or any other tribes, we're not on the topic committee, which means that we don't have control over that. That is an example of scapegoating. Their framework debate now. They have conceded a reason why pragmatism resolves for these sort of concerns, about why you can defend the United States federal government while still discussing these sort of concerns, and, yeah.
The scapegoating argument that my articulation of there not being a topic about the res, that argument is more specific about how framework arguments construct normative structures where USFG is the only valued topic starter, which means there's no Cherokee Nation should. They don't articulate in Josh's speech how that's an example of scapegoating or how that creates, they don't link that to scapegoating at all.
This is just really easy. Examples are allowed to be made in the LOR and the PMR. If that's not allowed to be done, I don't know what this speech is for.
I'm sure it's under consideration.
In addition, you can extend the second argument. Arguing that the use of fiat that could occur within the affirmative would not empower the state, but ultimately allow for them to challenge the state within the status quo. That is conceded. That is devastating. The impact of that argument is that you can defend the affirmative while resolving for all of their framework offense. On the impact debate, this is largely irrelevant at the end of the debate. Their argument about why we have a joke is they don't articulate why we have a joke. They just say that we say colonization is inevitable. That is not a joke. We are providing warrants for our argument. If that is true, then you can make arguments for why you'd be able to resolve for that. The link debate now. This is largely irrelevant at the end of the debate. They have not answered our hero was a democratically elected official and why this is important because democracy was created within Africa. On the case debate, I want you to remember what happens whenever they make demands. Arguing that if it is only the issue of the individuals in this room, then they foreclose upon that as a productive form of politics.
Overview, case and order framework.
Medium.
And the net benefits of the framework. Overview, case and order framework, net benefits of the framework.
In case and order quickly.
Framework, links, solvency impacts. Is everybody ready? Washburn Jail has won this debate definitively for three reasons. The first is that you conceded that interrogating our privilege comes from, coming from colonialism denies scapegoating, blaming the colonialism's impacts of the past. Thus we solve for the terminal impacts of your argumentations about how the point we provide or prioritize the counter-interpretation of G. Sleaze towards scapegoating other impacts or our personal responsibilities. Second argument why we win is there is no topical version of the act. This is a warrantless claim that they keep asserting about the United States federal government as evidence speaks, and his speech is not equivalent to South Sudanese tribes. There is no way that we can implement a policy for the U.S. federal government that helps these indigenous tribes. The third reason why we win is you concede that the conception of politics evolves to discussions to prioritize state control. This prevents us from being able to culturally cultivate new forms of discussions within the debate community which are critical to being able to interrogate our privilege, which is necessary to deny inceptions of colonialism. Only by allowing for these demands do we allow for ourselves to culturally construct and cultivate oppositional movements. Framework. They indicated that demands are counterproductive, but you can see that nihilism is inevitable at the point that we stop demanding action, or at the point we stop demanding an end to colonial violence, which indicates that we do not allow for scapegoating, but rather we allow for ourselves to prevent the inception of scapegoating. You also can see that we solve the terminal impact of scapegoating, which also indicates that our demands are critical to being able to to allow for an interrogative thought process. You also concede our number 4 framework argument that the United States federal government uses regulations and interpretations to deceive natives off the lands, that the interpretations always benefit the colonizer. This will be critical when it comes time for the framework debate, because we prove to you that their framework is colonialist. It is created in terms that allows for the oppressor to continue to have access to the activity and exclude discussions that natives need access now. Links. You indicated that we are just conflating African democracy, but you concede the analysis that the only reason South Sudan exists is so that the United States and international community could have access to their oil resources. Probably reason why the conception of African democracy is not independent of the United States, but rather a puppet of the United States colonization, ensuring the impacts that are going to be inevitable. Observation 3, solvency. They go for their argumentations about how thought experiences are inherently bad, but we indicate that if you do not interrogate your personal relationships, then we will inevitably scapegoat, we will inevitably deny the cycles of violence which assure that colonialism can just be replicated, where you next indicate that we destroyed identities outside the land, but there is nihilism outside of the status quo which assures that these tribes are not able to garner any kind of identity of the land. Furthermore, we don't physically give back the land, we are just a thought experiment allowing for you to interrogate how we, existing on this land, have privileged ourselves, the education that we experience, and how we continue to exist. You next indicated that we all are alike and we are leading towards artificial discussions, but you can see the fact that you as the judge and you as the listener are all that matters. Evan makes the second argument on the South Sudan that we don't center on natives, rather just the listener, and how the listener can deny inceptions of colonialism, which indicates that we're the critical first step. We are the base towards providing a radical interrogation of how colonialism continues to conceive itself. Impasse. You make arguments about how the state is inevitable and value to life has already existed. However, you are mocking the violence that exists in the status quo right now because you say that we should just not act because the state will inevitably act. This assures that we become complacent in the power structures that make colonialism inevitable. Your rhetoric literally allows for the impacts to become inevitable, and at the point that the affirmative is able to solve because we prevent or deny the inceptions of violence in the everyday, we can't check back. Framework debate. Genocide is not solved from a top-down approach, but rather is culturally cultivated. You concede that our counter-interpretation allows for cultural cultivation to occur within the debate community. Your argumentation is that our topical affirmative can allow for ourselves to talk about the South Sudanese, but cross-plot analysis from above was an argument in MG speech that the United States federal government is not the South Sudanese indigenous tribe. It is not the Nuer tribe. It is not the Abul tribe. You will not be able to prove that we had a topical version of the act. Next, you indicated that ground truths and terminal impacts because we structurally exclude the negative out of the space, but the negative interpretation forces us to oppressively roleplay as our oppressor, while at the same time it prevents natives from ever gaining access to space. Which means, and when you look at the numbers, more natives will be excluded from the debate space than negative debaters in this round. You next indicated that the point we know link your solvency arguments are proof. Wait, did you point of order? At the point you said that we know link your it proves abuse, but we indicate that the abuse has already occurred at the point that we are not allowed for these structural or interrogations of the privilege or colonialism that continues to occur. Next, you state that the United States federal government is not racist because there are Native American senators, but the actions of the United States federal government, the continued colonization of the third world is what is colonialist, which is why we are critiquing the methodology. Next, you indicated that our limits argumentations are non-unique because there will be inevitable forms of limits, but you can see that in the second argument on the limits, that at the point you limit out the native bodies, you exclude processes that question the rules of debate and how these rules exclude individuals. Finally, you indicated the K precludes, you also can see the K precludes criticisms of politics. There's hostility now against the natives. We allow for better democracy, better education, and better stasis for us to interrogate why this colonization exists in debate.